Today we're going to talk about cell organelles, and we're going to compare and contrast plant and animal cells. In my last video, we talked about what a cell is. And a cell is the smallest unit that can perform all of the processes necessary for life. And I always tell my students, cells are the building blocks for all life. They are the smallest thing that makes up organisms. We talked about prokaryotes and their characteristics, which were single-celled organisms. So one cell made up their entire being. They had no nucleus and they had no membrane-bound organelles. And we said that bacteria and archaea were our two types. But today we're going to compare and contrast our eukaryotic organisms and our eukaryotes. Eukaryotes, they're multicellular, meaning they're made up of many cells, and they have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. There's a recap of their characteristics that they both share in common. Both plant and animal cells are multicellular, have a nucleus, and have membrane-bound organelles. We've got plants and we've got animals that are our two types of eukaryotic organisms. So you are eukaryotic, and that's always a good way to help you remember when you're trying to differentiate between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. But why are these two types of cells different, plant and animal cells? And this is a really important topic. So I want to focus on this. We're going to talk about what creates the differences between plant and animal cells, and what differences do they have in their cells with different cell structures and organelles. Plants are producers, and this is really important. You've probably already covered this before: producers, consumers, and decomposers. And we're talking about the way that an organism obtains or gets their food. And plants are producers, meaning they produce their own food, and they use photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process by which green plants and certain other organisms can transform light energy into chemical energy, and light energy being that of the sun's energy. Then we've got animals, which are consumers, and consumers must consume, must eat and take in their food. They cannot produce their own, and they use cellular respiration. And this is the process through which cells convert sugars into energy. Now we're going to look at what do these two processes look like, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and how are they connected? Photosynthesis, we said, is the process by which green plants and certain other organisms can transform that light energy into chemical energy. But now let's look at actually what does that look like? What's the formula for photosynthesis? So we start with 6 CO2, 6 H2O, and light energy, which ends up giving us C6H12O6 plus 6O2. Now, that probably sounds like a bunch of jargon to you, but let's break down what those things actually are. Carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight, that's our light energy. Those are the things that plants need to photosynthesize, to be able to create their own food, their own glucose. They need CO2, water, and sunlight. That is going to have the output of glucose and oxygen. And glucose is just another word for sugar. So those are the inputs on the left side of the arrow, and on the right side, those are the things that the plant produces after they photosynthesize. So those are the outputs. All right, let's look at cellular respiration. We said this is how we as consumers and animals, the process that we convert sugar into energy. All right, so again, we've got our long equation. It's a little bit different than last time. And you'll notice that energy is ATP, adenosine triphosphate, as opposed to the sun's energy. As consumers, we can't use the sun's energy to create our own food. So let's break down this formula for cellular respiration. What we need is glucose. We get glucose as consumers from the things that we eat and consume. Glucose, sugars in the foods that we're eating. We also need oxygen, and we're taking in oxygen through our respiratory system. We're breathing it into our lungs, and that oxygen is allowing us to break down and convert those sugars into energy. So the inputs, sugar and oxygen, and the outputs, what is the end result of cellular respiration? Well, we end up with carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy that our cells are going to use to carry out all those really important processes. Now, if you breathe out right now, I always have my students do this in class. I want you to cup your hand in front of your mouth, and I want you to give me the most exaggerated breath out that you can possibly muster up. Did you feel that on your hand? That is what? That's water. You can feel the moisture and the heat that comes out as we're breathing out. We are exhaling out carbon dioxide and water. Those are two of the byproducts of cellular respiration. Now, the adenosine triphosphate, the energy, well, that's going to be used by our cells. So those are the outputs of cellular respiration. Now, I want to know if you notice anything about these formulas, because there is a really important connection between plant cells and animal cells. And this is why scientists, ecologists, conservationists are very concerned about how we're impacting our ecosystems around the world, and especially how we're impacting plants, trees, those producers that create and output oxygen, because we as humans breathe in oxygen and we need that to survive and for cellular respiration to take place. Let's look at our two formulas. We've got photosynthesis, and we can see we need carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and it's going to give us or produce glucose and oxygen. Now, for cellular respiration, you can see that we need glucose and we need oxygen, and we produce and put out, as consumers and animals, carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, which is also energy. Now let's look at these two formulas. Do you see any crossover? When we look closely, we can see that the output for photosynthesis is the input for cellular respiration, meaning that plants put out oxygen, which we then need to take in to break down our glucose. You can also look and see that the inputs for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, well, the carbon dioxide we are putting out in cellular respiration. So as we breathe out that carbon dioxide and water, and our cells are using that ATP, we are providing for plants and producers that carbon dioxide that they need to photosynthesize. So there is this connection between plants and animals, plant cells and animal cells, and photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And this is why it's so important that we're really mindful as humans how we're impacting planet Earth, plants, and ecosystems, because we are dependent on producers and we need oxygen to survive and to break down food, and vice versa. They also need us to be able to produce carbon dioxide so that they can photosynthesize. All right, now I want to look at what are those commonalities? What are the cell organelles and structures that both plant and animal cells share in common? And to be honest, most of the organelles and structures are similar. So we're going to have more similarities than we are going to have differences. And we're going to talk about what are those similar organelle structures in common. Now, if you look at both the animal cell on the left and the plant cell on the right, you can see that there's a lot of similarities. The differences, most strikingly to me, are the shape. We definitely have two different shapes. The animal cell on the left is more rounded and spherical, whereas the plant cell on the right is more rectangular and boxy. And then, of course, the color. We know that our plant cells are green, and we're going to talk about why that is. But let's look at the list of organelles that they share in common. We've got a cell membrane, the cytoplasm, the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, ribosomes, mitochondria, and the Golgi complex. Now, mitochondria is the plural. You might also see it written mitochondrion with an ION as the ending, and that's one single mitochondria, mitochondrion. And then Golgi Complex is also sometimes written as the Golgi body. But let's talk about what each one of these does. Now remember that an organelle is a tiny organ and that it carries out a role for the cell. So just like our organs in our body, like our brain and our heart and our lungs, carry out jobs that are really important to keep us alive, our organelles do the exact same thing for the cell and carry out really specific jobs inside the cell. The first one we're going to talk about that both plant and animal cells have is a cell membrane. And a cell membrane is a protective barrier that encloses a cell, and nutrients and water can move into the cell and waste can move out of the cell through the cell membrane. Now, the cell membrane is located on the outside of the animal cell. In a plant cell, it's located just within the cell wall. They have an extra barrier, which we'll talk about soon. But this is the gatekeeper. They're like the lock and key, the bouncer. They're the one who's going to decide who can come into and out of the cell. And of course, we're going to let good things move into the cell, like we need water to survive. We need nutrients, which we get from the foods that we eat. And then also we need to be able to get rid of waste. Just like a human gets rid of waste by going to the bathroom, a cell has to be able to get rid of waste as well and dispose of that. And it goes through that cell membrane. The next organelle that we share in common is cytoplasm, or I should say structure. Cytoplasm is the fluid and almost all of its contents within the cell. And this is a liquid, and it's mostly made up of water, but it contains other things as well. And we equate it to like a gelatin, because jello or gelatin would be something that would hold contents within it. Like sometimes people like to put other foods in jello, maybe pineapple or raisins, or like my grandmother liked to put carrots in there. I'm not sure why, but those things are contained and float within that gelatin. So the cytoplasm is that fluid that all of the contents of the cell are floating within. The next organelle is the nucleus. The nucleus contains the cell's DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. And the DNA has the instructions for everything about that organism, and it's the control center of the cell. We often equate the nucleus as the brain of the cell. And that's because just like the brain in our body, the brain is regulating all important jobs in our body, whether consciously or unconsciously or subconsciously. And our nucleus is doing the same. It has all the instructions in that DNA for all of the other organelles to know exactly what to do, and it contains all of that information. The endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum, if you look at both plant and animal cells, y'all can see that it is right off of the nucleus, and it is this blue organelle depicted here. We can also see tiny little ribosomes attached to it, which is something that's really important about, and we'll talk about why. But the endoplasmic reticulum is a system of folded membranes in which proteins, lipids, and other materials are made. These are really important. Proteins and lipids do a lot of things for our cells and for our body. And the endoplasmic reticulum is the internal delivery system of the cell. And we equate it to this road, because this road is how we transport things, in society. We're transporting Amazon packages and things that need to be delivered. Well, the endoplasmic reticulum is doing the same thing. It is where those proteins and lipids are made, and then they're going to end up into those ribosomes, and they're going to be able to travel throughout the cell. All right, ribosomes are the next one, and we saw that they were attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. Sometimes we abbreviate that as ER, and they're the smallest organelles in the cell. And this is where proteins are created, where they're made. And protein is a really important thing for the human body or for any organism. And they float freely within the cell, and they're also attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. And because proteins are so important, we're showing this muscle because it is going to help us stay strong, to grow, and to do really important jobs within the cell. Next, we have the mitochondria. I always tell my students it's the mighty, mighty mitochondria. It has so much power. And this is an organelle in which sugar or glucose is broken down to produce energy. Now, in consumers, we get that sugar from food. In producers, like plants, they get that energy from photosynthesis. But energy released by the mitochondria is stored in a substance called ATP. ATP is short for adenosine triphosphate, and this is what the cell uses to carry out work and important jobs. So this is very important, and it's like the battery of the cell, the energy of the cell, the thing that is keeping it running, like electricity, and so important to carry out all of those functions. The next one is the Golgi Complex. Both plant and animal cells have this, and you can see it in both of those cells. And it's the organelle that packages and distributes proteins. When we say distribute, we mean it's delivering proteins. It's getting them where they need to go. Lipids and proteins from the endoplasmic reticulum are delivered to the Golgi Complex, where they're modified to do different jobs, and then the final products are enclosed in a little piece of the Golgi Complex's membrane, and that membrane pinches off and forms a small bubble, which we call a vesicle. And this vesicle or bubble transports its contents to other parts of the cell. So we've got a mailbox here because we know that the United States Postal Service or the UPS or FedEx, they are the ones that are shipping things and delivering things where they need to go. They're distributing it. And that is what's really important about the Golgi Complex, is that it packages and distributes those proteins, modifies them, and transports it in that vesicle, the little bubble, to other parts of the cell. We've talked about a lot of organelles and structures that both plant and animal cells share in common, and the reality is that we actually have more similarities than differences. So now let's look at the list of those different organelles and structures. When we look at our animal cells, we have lysosomes, which is something that most plant cells don't have, and we're going to talk about why. And then we have small vacuoles, and you'll notice the S is underlined. Now, we do have a vacuole in a plant cell, but it's so different that I put it in this column for a reason, because animal cells have many small vacuoles. We'll talk about what those do. But now let's look at the list of differences within our plant cells. We've got a cell wall. You can see that rigid structure on the outside of the cell. We have a large central vacuole, and we have chloroplasts. So let's talk about what each of these does. In our plant cells, we have a cell wall, and it's a rigid structure that surrounds the cell membrane and provides support to the cell, and it's made up of cellulose. This is like a brick wall for your plant cells. Our plant cells contain a lot of water, and they also lack a skeleton like animals have. And so where they get this extra support is actually within their cells. They have this extra cell wall, a feature that we don't have in animal cells, which is going to be able to hold in all of that water. It's going to provide support and structure to the cell, and it's an extra barrier that we lack in animal cells, and you can see it's on the very outside of the cell. The next thing that plant cells have that animal cells do not is a large central vacuole. And when you look at the large central vacuole, it looks like a kidney-shaped pool. And that's perfect because this is a giant storage tank where the organelle stores water and other materials. And this is really important in providing structural support. And it also serves as storage, waste disposal, protection, and growth. And Plant cells, we know, need water to be able to photosynthesize. They've got to be able to have water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight in order to create their glucose that they need for the energy for everything in their cells in photosynthesis. So this large central vacuole gives them that storage tank. It aids in digestion, and it acts a lot like a lysosome in an animal cell, which we'll talk about, and serves a lot of purposes all within this one organelle. And you can see that it's very large in size. And one thing about the large central vacuole is when a plant actually has water and it's filled that large central vacuole, that is going to add turgor pressure. And hopefully I'm saying that correctly. But turgor pressure is the pressure that's then going to be exerted on the cell wall, and it's going to give it this support and structure. And it's also going to move materials to the cell membrane and to the cell wall, and it's going to allow that plant cell and that plant to actually capture more sunlight. So this is a good feature that's going to help increase photosynthesis. We equate it to a container because it's containing that liquid and that water. And then the last thing that's different about our plant cells is our chloroplast. And our chloroplast is like a solar panel. This is an organelle that allows us to capture the energy of sunlight to create or make food, and that's glucose or sugar. And our chloroplasts contain chlorophyll, and this is a green pigment. So this is where we get that green color in plant cells, and that's that different look that we see between the two cells. But that chlorophyll allows the chloroplast to capture the energy of sunlight. All right, let's talk about what an animal cell has that's different than a plant cell. We have small vacuoles, and now we just looked at the large central vacuole, so we know that a plant cell does have a vacuole, but the really key difference here is that an animal cell has many smaller vacuoles, and they take up a lot less room, but they still are storing digestive enzymes, and they're really going to help digest, and digestion is really important for the cell. And again, we're equating them to a container because they're containing these digestive enzymes. The lysosome, this is an organelle in animal cells that we don't have in plant cells because that large central vacuole, it serves that purpose for a plant cell. But in animal cells, lysosomes or organelles are organelles that are responsible for digestion within the cell, and they get rid of waste, which we need to be able to get rid of. They protect the cell from foreign invaders, and they also destroy worn out or damaged organelles. So this serves a lot of really important features, and we equate it to Lysol or a cleaner because it's doing all of that cleaning, getting rid of waste, protecting from foreign invaders, destroying those damaged parts. All right, now what I want y'all to do is we're going to use our notes and we're going to create a double bubble or Venn diagram. We're going to compare and contrast just like we did in our last video, except in our last video, we were comparing and contrasting prokaryotes and eukaryotes, but now we're just talking about eukaryotes. We're talking about our plant cells and we're talking about our animal cells. And in a Venn diagram, we know that we're going to put the things that they have that are different. So the only plant cells have is going to go in the left side, and the things that only animal cells have will go in the right side. And then that overlap in the middle is where we're going to place their similarities, things that they both share in common. And we talked about a lot of things they shared in common. Now, just to recap, the plant cells, we're going to put their different organelles over here. I also want you to put how do they obtain food, because how they obtain food is a big part of why they have those different organelles. Over to the right, we've got our animal cells. We're going to say what different organelles do they have and structures and how they obtain food, because that's different from plants, which also results in those key differences in plant and animal cells. And then in the middle, we're going to put the similarities, things that they both share in common. All right, so I hope that this has helped give you an overview, some understanding as to all of the organelles that are in our eukaryotic organisms and within us as humans, and the differences and why they exist, why plant cells have that chloroplast and cell wall and large central vacuole. And just remember, it all goes back to photosynthesis, and that plants can produce their own food and we can't. It would be nice if we could just go outside, lay in the sun, and create our own food, but we can as consumers. So now, if you'll fill out this Venn diagram that your teacher has assigned to you and complete your Google Forms assignment, you will be a cell expert and excellent. Until next time, happy teaching, and I'll see you in the virtual classroom.